Happy Sunday, guys! It's that time of week again, and our lesson today is from chapter 8. I hope you've had a good week. It's been a weird one for me, but all in all, not bad. So I thought we'd dig into today's story, and I hope these have been helpful for you in some way, and like I said in all the other videos, if you have any comments or questions, you can contact me anytime you want. So today's lesson is on chapter 8 in our books, and it's on the seeking Pharisee and the sinful woman. We're specifically looking at John chapter 2, verses 12 through 25, and then chapter 3, verse 1 through 4, verse 42. And the theme is that the Son of Man satisfies man's spiritual thirsts. So, a little bit differently, I'm not going to read the scripture in the video today. Though I highly encourage you to pause the video and read it yourself. It's just a very long one. It'll take up a lot of time. But I promise I have read it. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in it. It only comes from the book of John today. There's no other Gospels, because a lot of times John's stories are slightly unique than the other ones. If you want to pause and look up John 2:12 through 25 and 3:1 through 4:42, I highly encourage it. Our story has Jesus in Jerusalem, in the temple. The first part of the story is Jesus clearing out the temple. And then from there, he ends up going to the place where he's staying, and then there's this guy named Nicodemus, who is a super important Pharisee type person. He followed all of the rules. He visits Jesus and sees that there's something unique about him. And he asks Jesus if he essentially is if he is sent from God, as if he's another Pharisee. He's talking to him as he would another Pharisee of his status. Just kind of curious about it. And Jesus kind of gets to the heart of his idolatry, which I will go through in time. And then Jesus ends up going into Samaria. After he leaves Jerusalem, feeling a little bit discouraged, and he ends up with a woman at a well, and he asks for water, and it's in the middle of the day. It's kind of weird, but Jesus in this moment also sees her idolatry. And there's some unique things that I'll say about the Samaritans and why a lot of the Israelites didn't talk to them very much. But that is for the future story time. So this passage today, if you've read it, which I hope you have, is kind of focusing on Jesus speaking to people's hearts, right? So in each of these mini stories, in these passages with these people, Jesus kind of sees the heart of the problem. And he speaks into it, right? He has a message for each of these people, depending on maybe what their heart needs to hear. So I'll go through that, and we can kind of discover what that is together, what Jesus has to say to each of these people. So I'm going to turn to the story time, and as usual, I'm going to read it, and if there's something that I want to point out, then I will stop, and I'll kind of give you some of the background. That may be helpful, I hope. Our story time is called The Seeking Pharisee and the Sinful Woman. Whoosh! The strands of the whip wrapped around the table leg, and with a jerk the table flipped over and silver coins clattered onto the marble floor. The temple official reached out to grab the whip-wielding madman, but he was too slow. Another table crashed down and knocked him over. Startled worshippers screamed as cattle and sheep, driven by the whip, ran off in every direction. Over the people's shrieks and the noise of confused animals, an angry voice demanded, "Get those doves out of here! How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" Jesus was furious. He and his disciples had come to the temple in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. But when Jesus entered the temple gates, he saw not a place of worship, but chaos. Rows of stalls filled with noisy livestock went back and forth across the temple courtyard. Frustrated people bargained unsuccessfully for a cheaper price for the animals they were buying for their offerings. The clinking of coins and the voices of greedy money changers drowned out the prayers of faithful pilgrims who had traveled many miles to show homage to the God they worshipped. I'm going to stop there. So there's this temple scene that the Bible describes, and how in it you can clearly see in this that Jesus is very angry. And if you're wondering if his actions here were sinful, they weren't necessarily sinful. He didn't steal anyone's possessions, he was righteously angry, which is different than sinning. You can be righteously angry and still not sin. And in this case, Jesus was very, very righteously angry. He knew what the temple was supposed to be, and he also knew that what he was seeing was not God's will. And that made him angry. So Jesus' anger was that of a holy God who sees innocent people being defrauded and worship being turned into a corrupt business for the benefit of dishonest and greedy religious leaders. The temple was supposed to be a place of worship. And it was supposed to be a place that God could meet his people. And it was kind of the main deal. Like, people came from all over the place and traveled miles to be at the temple during Passover. And they would have incense that would wake up to God and as a symbol of their prayers, and they would sacrifice animals, like pure animals, for their sins. But a lot of them didn't want to travel with their animals. It would have been a lot harder. So they would just buy animals at the temple right before they were wanting to sacrifice them. But the thing is that the religious leaders, the people in the courtyards would charge an exorbitant amount of money for these things. So it ended up not being very fair. So this is kind of what Jesus is critiquing, right? Jesus saw religious leaders trying to get rich by exacting high fees to exchange foreign currency into temple money and by charging exorbitant prices for sacrificial animals. The vendors and money changers had changed legitimate services for pilgrims traveling from far away into a money-making racket to get wealthy. So instead of serving these people, the religious leaders were just trying to get more money out of them, which is something that Jesus saw and was really disheartened by. Also, because a lot of people came away from far away, they often had a lot of different kinds of money that they were exchanging. This would be similar to like someone coming from Canada and having to change currency, or someone coming from Mexico and having to change currency, But there was a particular special kind of coin that they accepted at the temple that was different from most all the others. And it was called the Tyrian shekel, and it was pure silver. And so money changers were usually at the temple so that they could exchange money from whatever the currency people were bringing into the temple currency, which was really specific. Alright, I'm in verse 4, or verse. I'm in paragraph 4, starting at seeing Jesus' passion. Seeing Jesus' passion for purging the temple, the disciples remembered the psalmist David's words, "Zeal for your house consumes me." Dishonesty and greed in the temple were signs of Israel's spiritual darkness. By ridding the temple of all that defiled it, Jesus was announcing to everyone, particularly the Jewish religious leaders, that he was the judge. He would make what was wrong right. The Jewish leaders didn't question the moral correctness of Jesus' action. They knew he was right, but they did question his authority to act. They demanded a sign from Jesus, and he gave them one, saying, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days." The Jewish leaders thought he was speaking about the Jerusalem temple, and the words didn't make sense. How could anyone destroy, much less rebuild, this magnificent temple in 3 days? What could he mean? Actually, Jesus was talking about his resurrection that would happen 3 days after his death. He was giving them a sign they demanded, and they didn't know it. Jesus did many miracles in Jerusalem, and people believed in him. Yet Jesus knew that people believed because they were fascinated by his miracles, not because they trusted in him as God. I'm going to stop right there a little bit. So Jesus did miracles mainly for the purposes, for redemptive purposes. Jesus often didn't just do miracles simply for healing or bodies or just to calm the waves. Oftentimes, when Jesus did a miracle, there was some deeper purpose for doing them. So each miracle Jesus performed usually had a redemptive purpose. Jesus came to earth to redeem his people from sin, not to eliminate suffering from the earth. Those are two kind of different things. So the purpose of these miracles was to point people to God and show them their need for him. But this isn't necessarily the response that he got from the people in Jerusalem at this point. It says that he knew they were fascinated by his miracles, not because they trusted him as God. And so Jesus knew the fickleness of their hearts. He knew that they were starstruck by the miracles he performed, but didn't actually change their hearts. So he knew that not many true disciples would come from Jerusalem. So this part of the story that we see here is kind of a precursor, something that points to what ends up happening, which is a lot of the people in Jerusalem would 3 years later be the same people that shouted to crucify Jesus before he was put to death. So this is kind of pointing initially, this is like the beginnings of pointing to how you can hear and see miracles as these people did, but it may not actually go to your heart. You may not be changed by it. And a lot of these people were impressed, but their hearts were not changed by the miracles they saw. And they didn't trust God as a result. Moving on. One dark night, a Pharisee named Nicodemus visited Jesus. He had seen Jesus' miracles and had many questions. "Rabbi, we have seen your miracles and know you must be a teacher from God," he said. "No one could do these miracles if God were not with him." Jesus gave a strange reply. "I tell you the truth, no one can enter God's kingdom unless he is born again." What puzzling words! Nicodemus wondered in response. How could a person be born from his mother's womb a second time? So I'm going to pause there. So oftentimes Jesus has some strange sounding responses to these things. Oftentimes he doesn't answer the question directly in front of him, but he'll have a weird way of going about the answer, right? And it's because oftentimes when Jesus is answering, he's getting to the heart of what's going on in the situation. So he's not discussing the shallow thing that they're talking about. Oftentimes in these situations, Jesus is digging deeper and addressing the thing that they're actually talking about. So in this case, Nicodemus was thinking in physical terms. He wasn't thinking necessarily in spiritual terms. So Nicodemus was the kind of guy who did all of the work to make sure he could get to heaven, right? He came from the right family. He did all the right things. He tried to understand everything he could. And he was asking Jesus for one more good thing to add to all the good things he was doing. And in this response, Jesus is saying that you can't get to heaven by doing all of the good things, right? So Jesus is telling him that there's a little bit more to that. Like, you need to be saved by grace through the Spirit to be saved. And it's not something that you can do specifically. Moving on. Nicodemus was a Pharisee, a leader of the Jews, and a scholar who had been educated in Greek philosophy. As a member of the Jewish ruling class, he knew the Jewish law thoroughly and followed all of the rules. At least outwardly, he did what was right. He had a position of respect and authority as a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. But Jesus knew it wasn't Nicodemus's education, family background, or righteousness that would gain him entrance to the kingdom of God. As always, Jesus spoke to Nicodemus's heart. The mention of the Sanhedrin in this passage. So the Pharisees had such a passion for keeping the law that they took all of the laws from early in the Old Testament. So a lot of the rules in the books of like Numbers and Leviticus, and they took the law and then they made other laws and built laws around them. So there's like God's law, and then the Pharisees built like man-made laws around it. So think of like a circle with a whole bunch of circles on the outside. And all the circles on the outside are the man-made laws that the Pharisees made up so that they could get at God's law in the middle. So they figured that if they kept all the man-made laws, then they would obviously be keeping God's law, right? So it was a very, very rule-based kind of thing. But these people were really respected. It wasn't that people looked at them and like, oh, they're trying too hard. Oftentimes people would see the Pharisees and respect them hugely because they worked really hard to keep God's law. Anyway, so in this passage, Jesus is kind of addressing Nicodemus's thought that he needed, in kind of like the Pharisee idea that you have to follow all of these rules to get into heaven, and if you don't, then you're kind of like, sucks for you. But instead, Jesus is kind of answering Nicodemus by saying, no, you can follow all of these rules, but unless you're born again, or unless you are born spiritually and have the Spirit within you, then it doesn't matter. Moving on. You must be born again, Jesus said. In a few words, Jesus swept away everything that Nicodemus was trusting in. His family, his education, and his righteousness. These things would never get him into God's kingdom. Jesus told this Pharisee that he had to have a spiritual birth. How does this happen? When the wind blows through the trees, you hear the sound and you see the leaves quiver, but you don't actually see the wind. Being born by God's Spirit is like the blowing of the wind. You can't see the Spirit, but you can see the change that the Spirit makes in a person's heart. Through the influence of the Holy Spirit, someone who once lived to please himself now lives to please God. Then Jesus used a picture that Nicodemus, as a student of Moses' law, would know well. Jesus compared himself to a bronze serpent that Moses had lifted up in the wilderness. When the sinful Israelites who had been bitten by snakes looked up into the bronze serpent on the pole, they were healed and lived just as the Lord had promised. In a similar way, all who looked to Jesus hanging on the cross will be saved from their sin and live spiritually. God's message in John 3 is this: God loved the world and sent his Son so that anyone who believes in him will have eternal life. Jesus was the Savior that God had promised to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. So this mention of the bronze serpent on the pole, it comes up. Yes. So the bronze serpent in the wilderness comes up in Numbers 21:4 through 9. Um, in the beginning of the Old Testament. And the story is that when people were dying from snake bites, looked up by faith to the serpent on the pole that Moses was holding up, they were healed. And so Jesus was using this image, trusting that Nicodemus was well versed in Jewish custom and stories. So Nicodemus knew the story very well. And he would have known what Jesus was referring to as soon as Jesus said it. And so in the same way, Jesus is kind of saying, just like the snake was held up and the people of Israel were healed by faith, by looking at the snake, if you look by faith to the cross, I'm in essence going to do the same thing. So it's about faith, right? So anyway, I encourage you to look up Numbers 21:4 through 9 if you're curious about the story. When Nicodemus left Jesus, he had many things to ponder. As the story of Jesus continues, you will hear about Nicodemus 2 more times. The situation in Jerusalem became rapidly more unpleasant for Jesus, so he decided to return to Galilee. Instead of crossing the Jordan River and going north along the eastern side of the Jordan River, Jesus chose to travel through Samaria, something Jews didn't do. Jews who hated the Samaritans would travel miles out of their way so as not to pass through Samaria. This is something I want to speak to because there's a lot of historical context as to why this was so unusual. And the Jews and the Samaritans from Samaria had a long history of being enemies. So this goes back to all the way in 722 BC, so a long time before, when the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, and some of the Israelites remained behind. So Assyria took some of the people, they took some of the Jewish leaders and took them to Assyria. But a lot of them, like some of the poor folk, were left behind in their homes, and the Assyrians came down and kind of intermingled with them. And so over time, those who remained behind ended up marrying some of the Assyrians. And so over even more time, the Israelites started to adopt some of the beliefs of the Assyrian people. So it became kind of a mixed thing. Like Israelites and Assyrians kind of intermarried, and their beliefs were kind of intermingled, and they even built a temple on Mount Gerizim or something like that. Sometimes the names even me. And they kind of established their own priesthood. And years later, when the Israelites came back under Nehemiah to rebuild the temple, the Samaritans offered to help them. But at this point, the Jews refused because they regarded the Samaritans as heathens. So, and from this time on, Jews and Samaritans just didn't talk. They saw each other as enemies. They didn't cross each other's paths. It was kind of ridiculous. And this had been going on for hundreds of years. So when we see that Jews hated the Samaritans, that's not an understatement. They did not get along. So for Jesus to go through Samaria was unheard of. No Jew would go through Samaria. They would take the longest trek around it just to not have to go through. So this was unusual right from the start that Jesus was doing this. At noon, tired and thirsty, Jesus sat down beside a well at Sychar. Soon a woman approached. This was strange because women never came to the well at the hottest part of the day, and they never came alone. I'm going to stop there too. So this woman at the well adds kind of to the unusual of this. So getting water from the well often was a really difficult chore. It was really heavy, and it got really hot in the afternoon, so most women would go into them in the morning or the evening when it was cooler, and they would go with a lot of women to try to make it a little bit better, right? So they would go in the morning when it was cooler, and they would go with all their friends, and they would make something that was really frustrating, a chore that no one really wanted to do, and they would try to make it a little better by being in community and going when it wasn't super hot. And so this woman comes in the afternoon alone, and this was really unusual. It most likely suggested that she was some kind of outcast in her village. So she couldn't go with all the other women, and she went in the middle of the day so that she could avoid them. So this is another unusual part of this story. This woman was probably an outcast. "Will you give me a drink?" Jesus asked her. The woman was surprised. Why would a man, a Jewish man, speak to her so courteously? She was probably thinking that he knew how great a sinner she was, how he would disdain her and show disrespect to her like everyone else in the village did. So, by speaking to her, it was unusual that Jesus would have spoken to her. First of all, in Jewish society, men didn't generally begin a conversation with a woman. It wasn't really typical. Second, a Jew would not talk with a Samaritan anyway. They really didn't like each other, so that was uncommon in a second way. And third, because the Samaritan woman was coming to the well alone at the hottest part of the day, it was reasonable to conclude that she probably did something immoral by standards of the day and was ostracized by the people of her village. So these are three reasons that she wouldn't expect Jesus to talk to her at this point. Jesus continued to say surprising words to the woman. "If you knew who I was, you would know I would give you living water. Water so you would never thirst again." "Oh," she thought, "if I had this water, I would never have to come to this well again." What the woman didn't understand was that Jesus was talking about water that satisfied spiritual thirst. He was that water. The woman, when she heard living water, Jews usually use the word living water as a way to refer to running water versus stagnant water. So we're talking about like a river or a stream versus water sitting in a bucket or a well for days on end. So when she heard this, she was probably thinking that Jesus could offer her water from a river or a stream so she didn't have to go to the well. And she was pretty stoked about that because she was trying to avoid people all the time, and why not go grab living water? But Jesus was talking to her about spiritual water. And in this moment, he was also speaking to this woman's heart. So this woman was probably ostracized by her community, and she was looking for love and acceptance in places that she wasn't going to find them. And she was searching for someone to make her happy that she wasn't going to find where she was looking. And so when Jesus responds to her, this is what he's talking about. He's saying that he is the living water, and he's the one who will bring happiness to her, not where she's looking currently. Jesus knew how sinful this woman was. She had 5 husbands and was now living with a man who wasn't her husband. No one in town wanted to be her friend, and she wasn't happy. Jesus also knew that her real problem was looking to people instead of God to feel loved. At first, the woman didn't want to admit her sin. Then she tried to distract Jesus with controversial religious questions. But Jesus gently and firmly showed the woman how she had sinned and how she was ignorant of God's grace and forgiveness. Finally, she understood and believed. She realized that her spiritual thirst could only be satisfied by Jesus, the living water. The woman ran into the village shouting, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could he be the Messiah?" The town listened to her story, and many believed in Jesus because of her testimony. So that's the end of our story time, and I think these two stories, three incidences in the book of John together, are really cool together. They say a lot of great things. In all of these interactions with people, Jesus saw the heart of the issue that they were talking about. He saw that Nicodemus was trying to follow all the rules, and he was educated and righteous, and he did everything he should do, and by all standards, people looked up to him as like the ideal of faith. But he felt like he was missing something, and Jesus saw Nicodemus and saw that he was missing something and said, "Hey, you can't work your way to grace. And the reason I am here is so that you could come to know God." So Nicodemus was being addressed by Jesus, saying that like all of these things that you're trying to do aren't going to add up. So it's grace and God's Spirit that you need. And then you move on to the Samaritan woman, who is an outcast. She is the opposite of Nicodemus. She is someone who is not only ostracized by the Jews because she's a Samaritan, but she's also ostracized by her community because of the things that she had done, and she was trying to avoid them at all cost. And Jesus saw her and saw that she was trying to find love in places that she wasn't going to find it. She was trying to find acceptance. And he said that he was the living water. So she wasn't going to find love and acceptance in all of the places she was looking. She was only going to be able to find it through Jesus. And then she gets so excited, and she ends up running and shouting to her village, which she was trying to avoid just the moment before. And because of her testimony, so many people in her village were saved, and they actually invited Jesus to stay for a couple of days, and more people were saved. So these different stories are kind of pointing out how people trust in many things other than Jesus to enter the kingdom of heaven. Some people think that they're believers because they go to church faithfully. Some people think that if their parents are Christians, they too are Christians, and others say, "I'm a good person, and I've done more good things than bad things, so I think I'll make it into heaven." But like Nicodemus, we can't enter the kingdom of God because we do religious activities. They are helpful. I'm not saying they're not. I think that it's super enriching to do them, but they're not what saved me specifically. The only way we enter God's kingdom is by recognizing our sin, asking for forgiveness, and being spiritually born again into God's family. And so it's interesting to consider these two interactions that Jesus had. He was addressing the things that they trusted in besides God. And he was able to speak into those things. So I hope that this week maybe you could think about the ways and the things that you trust in that besides God. We all have them. And just like these two people, maybe like we trust in all of the activities we're doing to get to heaven to be really good. Or maybe we are looking for love in every place besides God's love, like the Samaritan woman. Or it could be something different. But I hope that maybe you can think about that, because in these passages, Jesus is really lovingly pointing out that if we're looking for things that are not God, then we're not looking in the right place. I hope that if you have any comments or questions, as always, you are so welcome to message me. My email is mckinnis, MCINNISN, @spu.edu. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you. It was really great to have youth group a couple nights ago. I really enjoyed seeing some of your faces. And I hope that the rest of this coming week is good, and I hope your families are well. Have a great day, you guys.